In the late 19th century, a cartoonist took down one of the most corrupt and powerful politicians in American history with his sketches. Boss William Tweed stole potentially hundreds of millions of dollars from the public, but he was also one of the most important people in the development of New York City and its transformation into the nation's most prosperous and culturally vibrant center. But how could a man who existed above the law for so long be brought down by cartoons? Well, that's the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. You're looking at one of Thomas Nast's most famous cartoons, depicting Boss William Tweed, who ran New York City for about a decade and was part of a network that ran the city for a century. What are you noticing about Tweed here? Well, I see a towering, intimidating, and darkly drawn figure leaning confidently next to the ballot box at a polling station. And if Tweed here is counting the ballots, how do you think the election is going to turn out? And besides, what are you going to do about it, say? So by the end of this story lecture, you should have a solid understanding of how Boss Tweed and other bosses at this time fed corruption and subverted democracy to hold on to power. But lest we go any further, our exploration for today's story lecture is, how did Boss Tweed reflect the corruption of American politics in the Gilded Age? And how did cartoons take him down? But first, umbrellas out, because there's a storm of history coming your way. So if you remember from earlier videos in this series, America after the Civil War was in what was called the Gilded Age, and it was a term coined by Mark Twain as a time that might have appeared bright and golden on the outside, but on the inside was rotten and corrupt. And in this lesson, we're getting into that muck and the corruption. So let's start at the top, shall we? The corruption first seemed to stain President Grant's administration, even though Grant himself was not directly to blame. He was often seen as aloof or just incompetent to stop the corruption that was around him. One major scandal was the whiskey ring, which involved, you guessed it, whiskey producers. They were conspiring to avoid paying taxes by bribing tax collectors, politicians, and even Grant's personal assistant was involved. And then President Grant helped him avoid facing criminal prosecution by stepping in on his behalf. Also during Grant's administration, but revealing Congress's corruption, was the Credit Mobilier scandal. Credit Mobilier was a railroad company that was defrauding the government of millions of dollars and then bribing politicians to look the other way by giving them stock in the company so that they too profited from the theft of the American people. Now, when the scandal came to light, there were many politicians who were implicated whose careers did end, but none of them faced jail time. And the company was still able to rake in millions of dollars in profit despite stealing from the public. But the absolute epitome of Gilded Age corruption, greed, and guile was found at Tammany Hall in New York City, with Boss Tweed holding the reins. William Tweed was a born and bred New Yorker. He was the descendant of Scottish and Irish immigrants, and at the age of 11, he left school to begin working with his father. Then, early in his adult life, he was a volunteer firefighter at a time when fire companies acted more like gangs or fraternities than actual fire departments. They would often be fighting with other companies to be the ones to be able to put the fire out. Of course, it also happened that buildings occasionally burnt to the ground while they were brawling outside. And Tweed became known as one of the finest brawlers in the company, and soon started his own company that took for its symbol a Bengal tiger, which would soon be symbolic of his time at Tammany Hall. Fire companies were also tied to politicians and the political machines they ran at the time. Political machines were common during the Gilded Age, and they were simply political organizations that would exchange favors for votes. It worked like a machine to keep churning out votes, and then they would stay in power. And then in 1851, at the age of 27, Tweed was elected alderman for the 7th Ward in the country's most notorious, lucrative, and effective machine, Tammany Hall. Tammany ran New York City for over a century, and Tweed, being jovial, charismatic, a real people's person, he worked his way up the ladder. He served in Congress, and in 1868 he became the boss of Tammany. Tweed was a hell of a politician. He would walk the streets, shake hands, pass out cigars, kiss babies, and listen to his voters. He was a celebrity in many parts of the city and got many people to proudly vote Tammany in all elections. And the reason Tammany politicians were routinely elected was because they offered a lot to the people at the time. They would help many find jobs. They would help immigrants fresh off the boat find cheap housing, and sometimes help pay their rent and get schooling and eventually citizenship. And then once citizens, you can surely guess who they voted for. Under Boss Tweed, New York City transformed into a modern city. He oversaw the building of what was the marvel of engineering of the time, the Brooklyn Bridge. He also oversaw the construction of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Natural History Museum, Central Park, and hundreds of miles of roads, water treatment plants, and the beginning of the subway system. But before you start registering to vote for Tammany, there were serious drawbacks as well. Though they definitely did some good, they also plundered and pillaged. First, they often stole elections to ensure that they won. Remember the cartoon from the beginning? Well, on election day, machine men who worked for Tammany would rush into bars, pay the men's tabs, and then escort them to polling booths to vote. They would then bribe policemen and voting inspectors if they needed to. His men would get his voters registered at several polling stations, and on election day would ensure that voters voted multiple times. As they said, vote early, vote often. Elections in New York City at the time had more voters casting ballots than citizens actually living in the city. Are you seeing how these machines stayed in power? And beyond that, they stole tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from the taxpayers of the city. The single greatest swindling of public funds can be seen in the New York City courthouse construction under Tweed. Originally, it was budgeted for $250,000, but it eventually cost closer to $13 million, which in today's money would be closer to $250 million. $250,000, in fact, was just what they spent on brooms. And that brings us to Dad Jokes in History! Why couldn't the police in the city at the time put a stop to Tweed's political machine? Why? Because there was Tammany of them. Tammany of them? Please stop. Sorry, I had to. But if you think you got a better one, I'd like to see it below. But even if there was suspicion that Tammany and Tweed were stealing from the public or defrauding elections, you gotta realize that Tweed could bribe investigators, the police, judges, journalists, and so many leaders in the city depended on him for their pay, and staying loyal to Tammany could mean a bright future in the city. It seemed impossible to take him down. However, while corruption was getting Tweed rich, it was about to lead to the assassination of the President of the United States. Patronage was the practice of awarding political jobs to friends and supporters once a politician got into office. This basically meant that when a new administration came in as president, mayor, or party boss, they could award hundreds or potentially thousands of jobs to their supporters and get rid of anyone who would be a political opponent. But when President Garfield came into power in 1880, he was promising to change this and end patronage. But still, hundreds of party members would literally line up outside the White House looking for government jobs as rewards for helping his Republican Party get into power. And Garfield would have to turn these men down day after day. And now get this, he was assassinated by a man who believed that he would be pardoned by the new president, Arthur, and then celebrated as a hero by all those who could now get patronage jobs under President Arthur. Careful, this history is so good that it's got to be bad for you. And even after his arrest, he continued to believe that the vice president and the general of the US Army would come to his rescue. But he was literally insane and was executed instead. But more importantly, his assassination of President Garfield led to the passage of the Pendleton Act, or the Civil Service Act, which created a merit-based system where one had to show competency to get a government position. And even before the Pendleton Act passed, Thomas Nast's cartoons were beginning to raise an outcry that would bring down Tweed and Tammany Hall. Thomas Nast was not the first journalist to try to take on Tammany and Tweed for their corruption and crimes. But it was a dangerous game going up against such a powerful figure. Many journalists wrote stories and exposés of Tammany's fraud and criminal behavior, but they could not arouse enough public outrage to create change. But Thomas Nast's cartoons exposed Tweed more than the written word ever could, so he went full throttle against Tammany Hall. Working for Harper's Weekly, Nast created dozens upon dozens of cartoons attacking Tweed, showing him as destroying democracy, a criminal operating above the law, the man behind all the corruption and problems in New York, and rigging elections like the cartoon that we started with. And Tweed was realizing the damaging effect of Nast's cartoons, saying, "I don't care a straw for newspaper articles. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damned pictures." Tweed actually tried to bribe Nast to stop his cartoons for $500,000, but Nast declined, saying, "Well, I don't think I'll do it. I made up my mind not long ago to put some of those fellows behind bars." And that's exactly what happened. His cartoons aroused enough public sentiment that serious investigations started to chip away at the Tweed ring in Tammany Hall. Some of those in his inner circle fled the country. Others were charged and sent to prison. And in 1873, Tweed himself was found guilty of 204 charges, including fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and larceny, and sentenced to 12 years in jail. Though still having friends in high places, Tweed managed to get a private jail room with a view and later a 2-bedroom cell with a small library and even a personal assistant. And he was allowed carriage rides across the city. Not bad treatment for someone who stole tens of millions of dollars. Then in 1875, on one of his rides, he escaped out of the country and eventually sailed down to Cuba and then on to Spain. He could taste the sweet air of freedom once again. But actually in Spain, he was quickly identified by someone who recognized the portly figure from Nast's cartoons. And then he was sent back to prison to live the rest of his short life in Ludlow Street Jail, behind bars in the city that he once ruled. So, the Gilded Age was marked by economic growth, rising tides of immigration, urbanization, industrial giants, the struggle for workers' rights, and wholesale corruption. But all the horrible problems of this time would usher in a new era, an age of reform, known as the Progressive Era. So the pendulum of history swings, and it's reassuring to know that periods of great turmoil and problems are actually planting the seeds of their own renewal and rebirth. And if we are living right now through a second Gilded Age, let's look out to the horizon and use history as a guide to move us forward to brighter days ahead. So thanks for engaging with us today. This has been History for Humans. Hey, thanks so much for watching this episode. Could you take 1 second and do an act of charity and just click the thumb that looks like this below, and you can hit the subscribe button as well. And for teachers and homeschool parents, I have lessons and resources on my website, historyforhumans.com. That's historyforhumans.com. So you can save yourself a lot of time and just enjoy exploring history with your students. And if you're doing the learning activity that's found on my website, hang out because we got instructions in just a sec. Okay, today's lesson's gonna get nasty. Thomas Nasty, that is. What you're going to be doing in part 1 is analyzing one of Thomas Nast's cartoons that helped to take down Boss Tweed and expose Tammany Hall. You're going to be answering a series of questions that get you to really break down the different parts of the cartoon so you can really understand what makes it impactful. So really be thinking critically about everything that went into Nast's cartoon, because in part 2, you're going to be creating your own. Your cartoon can relate to Tweed, Tammany, or corruption in the Gilded Age in general. Make sure to follow the few requirements that are explained in the directions, but most importantly, make sure it is original and unique in your own. Don't just take Nast's idea and redo it. I would first consider what message you want to send with your cartoon, and then brainstorm how you could represent that. Okay, I really think you're going to enjoy this one, and drop an anvil on it when you're done, and crush it.